Right. Okay. So it was interesting when I saw this topic first kind of come up as something to talk about. I thought, I actually, as a woman, I'm not alienated by advertising. So have I missed 40 years of the chance to be really pissed off with the universe? Or, you know, am I not reading something right? Or have I kind of missed the narrative hidden somewhere in the advertising? And I think, you know, you have a lot of emotional reactions to the content of the advertising you see. And I think for me, I feel deeply annoyed and deeply frustrated by a tampon brand, for example, telling me to wear white and cartwheel down the beach. That irritates me. Does it alienate me though? And I think when I talked about Dove and starting to filter through the brand I work on, I started to go, what is alienation and how does it work? And how does Dove avoid it most of the time? I don't think advertising is the enemy. I don't think there is a silver bullet by which to solve alienation or the topics that women are affected by. But I think Dove gets it pretty right most of the time. No one's actually ever foolproof. That's why this title of this topic is actually more about bringing women into the communications. Because I think that's what Dove does actually do really well. It's deliberately not the solutions, 10 steps to never alienate a woman for the rest of your life, but it's how do you actually bring them in. So I wanted to take you today, I'll talk you through a couple of ads from last year, and I'll give you the context on them. But I wanted to talk first about kind of behaviours that are within Dove and how we work with Dove that are kind of changing the things we can get out of the communications. So the first one is probably the most obvious for Dove. It's probably the most obvious in total. It's about avoiding stereotypes. Dove became very famous 10 years ago now, scarily enough, 10 years ago, with the campaign for Real Beauty, which absolutely called out all the stereotypes of the beauty industry, and it took them head on. And stereotypes aren't a bad thing. They're not, you know, they're not at their absolute root, the root of all evil, so I don't want to stand up here and say they are. But they do tend to make us reduce our thinking down and to pinpoint something into a sort of pigeonholed, tight little box that we can say it is this person or that person. And I think what Dove does is it is brave enough to take on those stereotypes very overtly when it did it in the campaign for Real Beauty. So it's slightly less so now because that conversation has actually got some traction. And you see now that the Beyoncés of the world get advertising removed because it's been too retouched. So they stand up against it. You get more brands like L'Oreal that was just referenced, actually embracing age and embracing different kinds of women and presenting them differently. Dove has started that conversation and has been very committed to it. Dove uses real women, has always used real women, no actors, no models, no celebrities, no borrowed interest. So that's a really interesting start point because you have something in the DNA of the brand that says we will not start by stereotyping. We also look to understand the relationship between women and beauty. Now that is a messy space. Women are complicated beings. I can say this because I am one. But it's a really interesting challenge when you start to try and position a brand or your communications in that middle space between the consumer and the product, and you try and live in that middle sort of grey area. So when you set out to say, I don't want to be black or white, but I want to live somewhere in the middle, that kind of creates opportunities and problems. But for example, Dove has spent a lot of time not just studying their products, but studying women and understanding that 96% of the women in the world will not use the word beautiful to describe themselves. It's a language thing, it's a word, but actually that gives you a really interesting grit to start to work your communications from. And they always position themselves with an eye-level perspective, so they're always on the side of the women, which I think is also important. So again, back to the point Jane raised earlier of empathy. They start from a position of we're in a relationship with our target market. And I hate that word too. Applying the whole brain, which I think Dove does, and it's a very female way of approaching problems and approaching life. So advertising at its worst and its start is very linear, very rational. I win, you lose. I'm superior, you're inferior. But very much along that, I will create a problem, I will give you a solution, and you will need this. Dove, not so much. It actually tries to take in the context as much as the culture, as much as the product's efficacy or not, and actually wrap them all up together. So I think what we do is we start from, and it's a global brand, so again, huge amounts of trouble, just trying to unravel that. Because you can't presume to say that a woman in China has the same experience as a woman in America. But what you start to do is you try and find the similarities. So what's common about the world they live in that we can actually start to work with? When I started on Dove, coming from a planner, position in Australia, I got almost blown away by the difference. Because when you start to look at the diversity across countries that this brand operates in, you get lost in the difference. But what's actually more interesting is when you start to find what's common and what actually connects those people in sort of their experience and that shared experience. So when you start from there, it gets kind of more interesting. And actually, it seems bleedingly obvious, so I apologise for the simplicity of it. But thinking about women as humans and understanding the world they live in, I think a lot of times we forget about the rest of the world because it suits us to focus on how they engage with dishwashing liquid or how they do the washing or how they shower. But actually, women don't operate in one nice, neat little silo that's easily compartmentalised. So actually starting to think holistically about them as existing. The other thing that is really interesting, I think this is probably going to be the future for channel planning and media in the approach. Content is really interesting. Movies are really interesting. They've always operated in a storytelling mechanic. They've always operated differently. Differently to advertising, which 30-second linear broadcast, push the message out, see the sales go up. Content's much messier. It's much more organic. It's much more fluid. I would argue it's more female in the way that it kind of has actually structured itself. So trying to think sort of in a media sense, what is actually going to be organically possible. Very hard for marketers because it's not very easy to release stuff out there and see where it goes. And I'll talk about Sketches, a campaign we did last year later, and we adopted this approach. But because women naturally seek those connections and they seek to actually connect over things and talk about them, this kind of an approach that content naturally lets you do starts from a sort of a shared emotion. It starts from what the trigger of the emotional reaction and what's going to be commonly shared. So you start to get automatically from a different angle. It's not to say they don't do 30-second ads, but they actually try and look at the conversation, not just the sort of bit between the pack shot and the start of the ad. Being part of culture. This is probably one of the most powerful things Dove does. I'm saying that to myself and thinking whether that's true. But actually, I think a lot of the time as planners, we forget that our brands live in the world. Again, it seems really obvious, but we sort of think that we spend a lot of time just looking at our category and looking at that piece of the shelf of the supermarket that people buy from. But actually, brands don't operate like that. Brands operate in a much bigger landscape, as people do. And I think a lot of brands step away from having a point of view. There's that risk to the bottom line and there's that risk of the share going down. Dove is very brave, and it really actually does stand at the forefront of that conversation, and it does take a point of view. Very clearly knows what it stands for, and it has stood by that for more than 10 years. It's a 57-year-old brand, I think it is now, and it has had a point of view the whole way through about how to change categories and how to change women's lives. It obviously did it very, very clearly with the campaign for beauty, but I think it's still doing it. And when the two examples that I'll come on to, Camera Shy and Sketches, have done it most recently. But they don't start from what women are. And I think this is a point sort of being touched on by the two previous speakers. If you start from what women are, you never get to think about them as anything else. If you start from where they are and how they live and how they function, you get to a much more interesting insight space from the get-go. So it's kind of little tricks that we sort of employ with Doves. They're not tricks in the sense of manipulations, but sort of little approaches that we take. And I think that is actually what's changing the way they communicate. We use media to activate their natural tendency to want to communicate. Women are talkers. Again, I've probably got to put my watch on for the first time in ages to keep an eye on the time, because there's an ability in us to naturally connect, communicate and share. That, if you apply that over the media lens, actually also will change your behaviours as a brand. And recontextualising your strategy to start new conversations. As I said, the campaign for Real Beauty started 10 years ago. 10 years ago this year, actually, the first white paper was published. It's very hard as a planner to come into a brand that is sort of tightly locked. The strategy is locked in terms of that we don't want to change it. It's working. We've got a really good point of view. We know what we stand for. We don't want to deviate from it. So what you have to do is find what's true in that and recontextualise it. And actually be okay with the fact that it may not turn out exactly like it did 10 years ago, but actually be allowed to let that flex and change occur as it naturally should. Controversially, and I had to clear this with my client, actually, we had a good chat about this point, not shying away from reaction, not backing down from sort of the fight. Because if you start a conversation, you can't actually control where it's going to go. You can't control the fact that somebody might be alienated by it or not alienated by it, might be offended by it or say that's not for me. And that actually needs to happen. The brand needs to allow that to be okay, because if you really want to change and create a change, and in this sort of post-feminist world we're still discussing this, but if you really want to provoke a reaction and a change, you have to allow that reaction to happen. And it will always happen. Haters will always be haters, lovers will always be lovers, and you'll always get the people in the middle. And I think you need to allow for that space to happen. Let your consumers carry your communications. I think that's a really interesting one, because I think when you talk to women and how you bring them into that conversation, letting them have ownership and being part of the communications is a really critical thing, because they will actually move it on for you. and they will evolve it and make it personal and share different experiences around it. I can never presume to predict exactly what reactions an advertising is going to have, or any communications. But that's part of the joy of working on a brand like Dove, is you have to go, I really hope it's going to have this response, but I have to be okay with the myriad of things that will happen in the middle. I want to talk in a little bit more depth about 2 campaigns that I think are kind of the most recent examples of bringing this all together for us on Dove. Work I'm very proud of, work I'm very happy to say I was part of, but really interesting kind of proof points in different ways about sort of what Dove stands for and how it operates. The first one is called Dove Camera Shy. And myriads of results around this, so I didn't kind of decide to inundate you with them, but happy to share some more if there are some more. Interesting, when you start from the point that 96% of women in the world actually don't like how they look, so that's your fundamental sort of start point for the brand. Women today are living in an unprecedented age. No one has ever been as photographed as we as women are right now. So, interesting fact that you think half the women are more scared of having their photo taken than public speaking. So you start to go, there's a behaviour change going on culturally that's actually informed by a lot of different things. Women today will delete more photos than a woman took 5 years ago. You know, just the de-tagging, the deleting. You think about how many times a day you remove an image of yourself and actually what that does for your self-esteem as a result, like what you're expressing openly through it. The interesting thing about both of these ads that we did some sort of study on them, and the fact that I think what made them work incredibly well, lots of things made them work very well, but one of the key things was that they elicited multiple responses psychologically and emotionally. And I think that's really interesting because, again, women don't just react as I'm happy or sad. They'll have a diversity and a range of reactions within there. And both of these pieces of work actually really strongly over-indexed on multiple emotional reactions, which was something that Unruly, who we did the work with, actually said was sort of what made them shareable. Because you talk about, we spend our lives, what's shareable, what's likeable. That's a huge reason why. 57 million views around the world. This ad worked incredibly well in China. You know, you sort of think, would this ad travel? And yeah, it actually really, the response in China was huge because the insight was very universal to women and something that every woman they could feel they could connect to their mother, their sister, their daughter. And over 60% of them were female. So you can actually quantify the fact that more often than not, again, we didn't want to alienate men. They came into the conversation too, possibly shared it with their wives, girlfriends, lovers. Hopefully this will play okay. This is Camera Shy.
Kiss you, keep you out of mischief, make your blue sky do, silly to be shy with you, no. Peekaboo, peekaboo, I'll kiss you. Peekaboo, I love you. Better make your mind up that you love me too, 'cause you're gonna marry, you know who. Peekaboo, peekaboo, I love you. Peekaboo, peekaboo, I love you.
It was released as a digital film, so it wasn't actually broadcast as a really stock-standard ad. Once we saw it start to spread, and that was something actually that Unilever are very brave in doing, they kind of really do adopt that organic behavioural approach to respond to the media and the likeability in the conversation. When I first saw that in a script form, not even in the footage form, I went, oh my God, I do that. You kind of, as a female, I went, that's exactly the behaviour I do. And I think that was sort of when you go, that's true and that's going to be shareable. The final one, I think I'm okay on time, the final one I don't want to show was Real Beauty Sketches. Very well seen, very well known, very well talked about, all those wonderful things that we as advertisers and as planners want to get. It was really interesting because it was kind of almost reopening the original Dove conversation. So Dove, after 10 years of the campaign for Real Beauty, had very successfully done a lot of change, done a lot of good to open a new conversation. But you're living in a world where retouching is banned by even publications in France. So actually it's legislated against, it's really hardcore. But actually there's something innately behind that women still kind of hate themselves. You know, unfortunately, we all do. And I said to the creators when I briefed this, I said, look, I can now look at a movie poster and know that Kate Winslet's boobs have been made bigger. I can do that. I can read the articles about Beyonce, that's all fine. But I'll still beat myself up. I will absolutely still beat myself up. And that's just human nature. And no awareness or education will change that. That is still innately female to do. And we went back to the original research from a few years ago, and women identify themselves as their own worst critic. So actually you start to go, God, there's something really interesting going on there, that just in the psychology of women and how they approach it, that it is kind of powerful. Again, part of its successes, so it didn't just elicit 1, but 6 psychological responses, so hugely shareable. And what we found was when we looked at sort of how this was passed around the world, it really did go mother to daughter to best friend to sort of bounce around the world. Female connectivity was what was really driving it. The creative was beautiful, but actually it was the woman-to-woman conversation that was more powerful. Third most shared ad ever, 97% like rate. You know, all those stats are great. I mean, you look at them and you think, but actually it was more that it made me cry, it made me react, it made me want to pass it on. So this is Real Beauty Sketches, hopefully.
I'm a forensic artist, worked for the San Jose Police Department from 1995 to 2011.
I showed up to a place I'd never been, and there was a guy with a drafting board.
We couldn't see them, they couldn't see us.
Tell me about your hair.
I didn't know what he was doing, but then I could tell after several questions that he was drawing me.
Tell me about your chin.
It kind of protrudes a little bit, especially when I smile.
Your jaw.
My mom told me I had a big jaw.
What would be your most prominent feature?
Kind of have a fat, rounder face.
The older I've gotten, the more freckles I've gotten.
I would say I have a pretty big forehead.
Once I get a sketch, I say thank you very much, and then they leave. I don't see them.
All I had been told before the sketch was to get friendly with this other woman, Chloe.
Today I'm going to ask you some questions about a person you met earlier, and I'm going to ask you some general questions about their face.
She was thin, so you could see her cheekbones. And her chin, it was a nice, thin chin.
She had nice eyes. They lit up when she spoke.
Cute nose.
She had blue eyes, very nice blue eyes.
So here we are. This is the sketch that you helped me create, and that's a sketch that somebody described of you.
So yeah, that's...
She looks closed off and fatter. Sadder, too. The second one looks more open, friendly, and happy.
I should be more grateful of my natural beauty. It impacts the choices and the friends that we make, the jobs we apply for, how we treat our children. It impacts everything. It couldn't be more critical to your happiness.
Do you think you're more beautiful than you say?
Yeah. Yeah.
We spend a lot of time as women analyzing and trying to fix the things that aren't quite right. And we should spend more time appreciating the things that we do like.
So there we go. Beautiful piece of work. I think just, my final point would be not to impose an image on people and let your brands be discovered by women, and then I think they will take them and own them, and you will bring them into the conversation.